Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the VMUG virtual event Keynote. My name is Kit Colbert. I'm the CTO for Cloud Platform at VMware. And for the Keynote today, we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of me just blabbering on forever, we decided to have a bit of a moderation panel here and talk about all the exciting things that are happening in the world of modern applications and Kubernetes. And so on the panel today, I've got two esteemed colleagues. I have Joe Beda. He's the co-creator of Kubernetes, co-founder of Heptio, and now a principal engineer in our modern apps division at VMware. And we have Jared Rosoff. He's senior director of product management for vSphere, and the brains behind Project Pacific and a big driver of it. So obviously very deep into the Kubernetes world as well. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us on.
So I've got a whole list of questions, but you know what? I know you guys pretty well. I think it'll be pretty free form. So see, already joking.
Are you going to surprise us with new questions?
Well, I was going to try, but that's why I'm not letting you look at the paper. I feel so much better actually holding this like this. I'm very proper as a moderator. Okay, so look, we've got a lot of customers. Probably a lot of them have heard about Project Pacific. Many of them may have heard about Kubernetes, but I don't know how many of them are super familiar with it, have used it before. So maybe just toss that out there to begin with. Tell us a little bit about what is Kubernetes, why is it important, why should the VMUG attendees here be looking at it and thinking about it? Joe, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a little bit of history of Kubernetes. We started it when we were at Google, and it's really based on about, at that time, 10 years of Google's experience running their stuff in production. And what it really is it's a system and an API that interfaces infrastructure to developers in a way that really lends itself towards building cloud-native applications. And when I say cloud-native in this context, I mean applications that really take the most advantage of the dynamic nature of cloud. API-driven, self-service, elastic, all that stuff is easier to consume with Kubernetes-like API. And so what's really interesting, I think, as we've seen this sort of play out over time, is that number one, Kubernetes is super flexible where it can run in all sorts of different environments, whether that be on-prem, in the cloud, on the edge. We've seen it running everywhere from like storefronts all the way up to large data analytics for high energy physics, right, and everything in between. So incredibly flexible piece of technology across the all these different environments, but it also provides a really clean API interface between the infrastructure layer and developers in a way that developers can get the most out of across all those environments.
Mm-hmm. And so would you say we're still pretty early days in Kubernetes? Like, how are you looking at it in terms of where we are in the maturity cycle?
Well, we're 5 years in, and I think the Kubernetes, the core concepts are set. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks are getting a lot of value out of it. Mm-hmm. But right now, really to sort of get the most out of it, you kind of need to be a Kubernetes expert, right? Yeah. Because it's so flexible. Along with that comes a lot of choices that you have to make about how you need to configure it to you. And so one of the things that I think is really exciting as we look at sort of the different aspects of Pacific is that we're looking to essentially find the configuration, the way to use Kubernetes that really is going to be sort of the sweet spot for a lot of the enterprise customers that are using vSphere now. And in doing so, create a new interface between vSphere, between that infrastructure and application teams.
Got it. So in terms of the adoption curve, we're still kind of on the leading edge. A lot of early adopters, people playing with it, but seeing some stuff in production already.
Oh yeah, a lot of companies are running it in production, but they tend to have to invest more than I think they would otherwise have to if we want to really hit the wide spot of the market here and really make it be as mainstream as we think it's going to be.
Got it. So Jared, obviously VMware made a lot of announcements around Kubernetes at VMworld this year. So why is VMware going all in on Kubernetes?
Well, I think if we rewind the clock to the beginning of what became Project Pacific, I think to what Joe said, at VMware we are struggling with a lot of the same issues. Like there's tens of millions of workloads running on top of vSphere. Customers are asking like, how do I modernize those workloads? How do I bring that universe of stuff I've already got into this modern era? And we were looking at like, how do we provide better developer self-service? How do we cater to these new kinds of apps that require sort of programmatic control of infrastructure? And when Kubernetes came out, it was actually inspired by one of your early talks, Joe, talking about Kubernetes as a platform. And we started asking like, well, maybe we could take this thing and actually use it to transform vSphere itself. Like maybe Kubernetes could be applied to all those tens of millions of workloads that are already on the vSphere platform. And so, as we started doing this, we realized that it was almost like you guys had anticipated every weird nuance and difference in the vSphere platform. Was anybody on the Kubernetes team actually familiar with vSphere?
I don't think so. I mean, like I cut my teeth server side at Google, and so which is a sort of a weird way to learn it because nobody else does stuff the way Google does. But there's a lot of, I think, universal lessons that actually bubble their way up through this stuff. Yeah.
Well, so as we went through this, it was kind of like chocolate and peanut butter. Like every time we found, hey, how are we going to do identity management, or how are we going to hook into the hypervisor runtime, or how are we going to hook into networking or storage? It was like the Kubernetes was like designed to have all the right plugin interfaces and extension points to be able to do this. And so I think what's really exciting is the idea that we can take Kubernetes and apply it at this layer below how most people look at Kubernetes today, at vSphere itself, and how we can bring forward those tens of millions of VM-based applications and bring some of these benefits of integration and control and developer self-service. And in fact, probably one of the best test cases of this was when we actually put Kubernetes on top of Kubernetes, right? That, when you talk about what does it take to make the best platform for running Kubernetes, you need something that can do lifecycle, that can do health checking and monitoring and, repair. And we realized hey, the answer is right there, it's Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So we should probably delve into that a little bit more.
Yeah,
But Kubernetes on Kubernetes is actually, a key piece of Pacific, and it bakes your noodle a little bit, but it works really well.
I know. We've been, trying different ways of explaining that concept because, it is a little weirdly turtles all the way down type situation. Okay, before we get into Pacific some more, maybe, Joe, you could take us through the broader Tanzu narrative that we announced at VMworld.
Yeah, for sure. So Tanzu is a portfolio of products and services that's really aimed at bringing cloud native and modern application to enterprises. And whereas Pacific is firmly grounded, and we'll get to the details there, in the vSphere world, Tanzu is really looking across both that vSphere world and the wider cloud world. And so we break it down across three different dimensions: build, run, and manage. And so with build, it's really about providing the tools, the techniques, the knowledge so that application teams can adapt their applications, whichever type of application they have, so that it runs well on a cloud-native platform. And so this includes the anticipated acquisition of Pivotal, bringing in that. They have this amazing sort of code to production pipeline for applications where you're actively developing them that way. It includes Bitnami, in terms of adapting both open source and existing software, packaging it up so that it can run in cloud on containers, and then also partnering with folks so that we can bring more and more services to it. So that's the build leg of the three-legged stool here. Run is really about providing a consistent implementation of Kubernetes across all these different environments, on-prem, cloud, and at the edge. And it's not just about the consistent about what's running inside the cluster and the cluster environment, but also how we manage clusters. Because one of the things that we see is that we're going to see a proliferation of clusters. We're going to see a lot of clusters for security reasons, for application isolation reasons, for organizational reasons, for geography reasons. We're going to see the proliferation of clusters, and we want to make sure that we have a consistent way to manage those clusters, and then have the clusters that we produce be as consistent as possible.
And it seems like that's an emerging best practice, by the way, within the Kubernetes community. It's like
Yeah,
rather than
exactly.
having one giant cluster, you got a lot of smaller ones for a variety of reasons: fault domain and security and other sorts of things.
Exactly. So we think that the future here is there's going to be some folks and there's going to be some situations where you run a few large clusters, but I think more common for all those different factors is that you're going to run a lot of smaller clusters.
Yep.
And so that really brings us to the third leg of the three-legged stool, which is manage. And so that's about how do we deal with these things at scale. And when we say at scale, we just don't mean number of nodes or number of workloads. We mean the number of different teams, the number of clusters, just that sort of complexity that creeps up on you in any enterprise situation. we have a product as part of that called Tanzu Mission Control that really helps you wrap your arms around all the different places where you're running this, understand the mapping of application teams to this infrastructure, and then provide the policy tools necessary so that you can provide that self-service access to developers with confidence, knowing that you still have the policy controls in place that you need. So you package all that stuff together, and that's what we mean by VMware Tanzu. It really brings all that together under one roof.
Yeah, and that was pretty exciting to see. It's this notion that VMware is really looking at this problem holistically, end to end, and focusing on developers in a way that we traditionally haven't, right? I think that's a really exciting part about the build part specifically, but obviously the entire thing as well. This notion of the acquisitions of Bitnami and the pending one around Pivotal and that sort of thing. But what also is really interesting to me is that run aspect and this notion of kind of Kubernetes everywhere, and that, I mean, let's be honest. Like, our belief is that Kubernetes is the future of the infrastructure abstraction, right? And there's something really, really powerful there, and that we think this is actually a better way to interface and interact with infrastructure. And so maybe on that note, Jared, you can talk about that idea of Kubernetes as an infrastructure interface and the thinking behind that in terms of Project Pacific.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's kind of like a Goldilocks situation here, right? Because I think when you think about programmatically controlling infrastructure, you have to pick the level of abstraction you're presenting, right? And there are things that are really low down in the stack where you can pick your firmware versions and which chipsets you want to emulate. But the problem with working at that level is they give you a lot of knobs, but like as a software developer trying to deploy a web app, that's maybe too much control, too much things you have to worry about. Then you got things like really high levels of abstraction of just like, hey, here's my code, just run it. And that's really great for that web app, but if I'm building like a high frequency trading platform and care about every microsecond of latency or real-time systems, that's
machine learning,
exactly.
Big data analysis. There's a bunch of things.
Exactly, and so I feel like across VMware, across our industry, I think we've all been sort of searching for what's that right level of abstraction. Some things that are too high level, some things that are too low level, and Kubernetes really nailed it in terms of, I think, talking about the sort of assembly language of infrastructure, that there's abstractions we can build on top of it to get to the serverless and the kind of CF push like experience of just pushing code. But you also have enough access to the underlying infrastructure that when you need to go in and get that last ounce of performance, you can do it.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about that is this evolving notion of what infrastructure is, right? Yeah. Because traditionally for VMware, our view of infrastructure was, okay, everything kind of outside the VM. Everything inside the VM, the guest operating system, the application, any sort of middleware, well, that was not really infrastructure. That was something, a different concern. Obviously the hardware, all these other things we could take advantage of. But as we've seen the standardization of Linux containers, of things like Kubernetes, I mean, Kubernetes, what it does, to some degree, used to be considered middleware, right? I mean, some of those container orchestration type things.
Yeah.
But now, because of the fact, I mean, by this point, pretty easily the second most popular open source project ever. I mean, on the trend toward there. I mean,
there's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's huge, right? And so that standardization has allowed us to say, oh, well, no longer should this be a concern of non-infrastructure concern. We actually can consider it part of the infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that along with that, when we talk about infrastructure, I think for a long time, workloads in our data center were virtual machines, right? I had an Exchange server, an FTP server, a web server. And the way I managed my infrastructure was just by looking at each of those workloads, and I could reserve capacity for them or move them around or back them up. But as we enter this, the modern app era, like an application isn't a VM. It's a collection of things, and it's not just a collection of compute things. It's a collection of compute, network, and storage. They're spread across different geographies. They require different kinds of hardware capabilities, and so with that, we have to evolve how we think about managing infrastructure. If I'm still down in the weeds, like trying to touch every individual VM in my 10,000 server data center, like I'm going to need more admins than anybody else.
Doesn't scale.
We need higher levels of abstraction to let me manage like an entire application, right? I want to snapshot an entire app, not the 10 VMs that are inside it.
So I think what this all is talking about is that cloud changed the game, right? I think cloud changed the way people view infrastructure, both from the infrastructure side, but also from the developer side. And I think a lot of what we've done up until now is look at cloud from the point of view of economics. I'm paying somebody else to run my computers for me. It's an OpEx, CapEx type of discussion that you're having. It's sort of hardware ops as a service type of thing. But along the way, the API-driven, self-service nature of cloud changed the way that people developed applications. And they have a richer set of services that they expect, and they actually deal with their infrastructure in a different way than they have historically. And so what we're doing with both Tanzu and Project Pacific is really bringing that best of the cloud experience for developers, and we're making that universally accessible across all sorts of infrastructure. But then, looking at it through the lens of vSphere, really making vSphere be the best place to be able to run this stuff.
I think there's an interesting element there, because I think there are these two communities that are coming together right now that I think, you got developers that have been building apps on cloud. And to them, the cloud is just this black box. You push a button, something happens. But if something goes wrong, also, it's a black box, right? And you're there on your own trying to figure out how to work around it. Then you have the world of like operations and IT, where we're sort of started off like in our data centers, managing servers, and then ultimately managing virtual infrastructure. But the developers were kind of behind a curtain somewhere else, taking up all of my compute capacity, right? And so I think that the challenge has been, you can get this great developer experience in the public cloud, and you can get, on the other hand, this awesome operational support team in your private data center, but you didn't necessarily get that great developer experience. And when you go to, and so the trick is like, what I find really exciting is like, how do we meld these two worlds together? We talk to a lot of customers who say, in order for me to really build these mission critical applications, I need that productivity of the public cloud services, but I also need the expertise of my infrastructure admins to be able to help me run the most reliable, highest performing, most cost efficient kind of platform possible.
Yeah. I mean, I talk a lot about disambiguating this notion of cloud, because when we use that term, we oftentimes use it in two different ways.
Yeah, you can
right?
look at it from either direction.
Yeah, it's like there's cloud as a place, a public cloud, which we know all about, but then there's also cloud as a model, which I think is what you guys have been getting at. There's a certain way of doing business in the cloud, a certain way of working, this notion of self-service, this notion of consuming via APIs and being able to automate all these things. And so the question is, I think to your point, Joe, it's like, how do we deliver that cloud as a model, but to any place that a customer wants, right?
And within the constraints and the controls that any sort of responsible enterprise needs to be able to apply.
Exactly. Okay, so I think you've been avoiding my question for a while now. So what is Project Pacific? Let's get to it. What concretely is this thing? It sounds amazing. I know, yeah. So we're talking about it all philosophically.
So Project Pacific is, an evolution of vSphere, right? And it really brings a couple key things. It's the vSphere you know and love. So as a VI admin, it looks and feels and operates exactly as how you've always expected it. But what Project Pacific brings is, first of all, this new concept we call the supervisor, which basically provides this self-service interface to developers at the infrastructure level. We leverage Kubernetes to do it. It's not, don't think about this thing as a Kubernetes cluster. It's vSphere. But it's providing now a self-service interface for developers. Secondly, it is providing a bunch of services to those developers. So first and foremost, a Kubernetes service, right? So they can point and click or run a command to get a Kubernetes cluster on demand. But it's also providing access to virtual machines, right? I can get a virtual machine out of my data center with just a run of a command. And also this new concept we call native pods, which are these hypervisor isolated container runtimes, which provides awesome security and performance characteristics, but with all the benefits of containers as well. And so to a developer, it presents this great platform for building new applications.
And specifically via Kubernetes, like a Kubernetes interface.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
It both provides Kubernetes and uses Kubernetes to provide Kubernetes.
Exactly.
And and that using Kubernetes in some ways a detail, but it also means that you get a certain level of consistency between these layers. Yeah.
It's the only times we can use Kubernetes in this conversation.
But what's also interesting, there's the other half of Pacific, I think, for the operations team, is that we build off some of these constructs in Kubernetes, like the namespace, and say, what if we can transform the unit of management inside of vCenter? So rather than as an IT admin touching each of the individual VMs, what if you can look at whole applications and apply technologies like DRS and vMotion and vmcrypt and things like this, and actually have that apply to an entire application at once rather than having to go configure each individual thing.
And by an application thing, a set of VMs, a set of pods, like
Exactly.
some set of stuff. And
Yep.
it could be arbitrarily large or small depending on what the app
Exactly.
is. Yeah.
So it's that combination of providing this great new developer experience for the developers in your enterprise trying to build new applications, coupled with this great new operations experience that makes it just way easier to manage larger systems, be more productive and more efficient.
And it creates a more sort of direct relationship between operation teams and developers,
Yeah.
right? Instead of having this be through, cumbersome sort of manual processes, you can really,
Exactly.
yeah.
Well, I think they see the same things as well, right? This notion that these Kubernetes objects are now there in the vSphere client.
Yeah, I have a common story. You talk to an admin, and they'll tell stories of like, so what happens when an app team raises an issue with IT, right? And it's like, well, okay, the first hour is spent figuring out what the heck they're even talking about. So they say like, my database is slow, and you're like, great, can you give me the MD5 hash name of the virtual machine in my vCenter view so I can find it?
Yeah.
Because the developer doesn't see that; they see some layer of abstraction above that, and that's been a problem. We fixed that in Pacific. The next problem is almost every IT admin says like the root cause of every one of these things is somebody changed something, right? And what got changed, right? All I can see is what this VM is configured as right now. But what Kubernetes brings is this very structured way of applying changes to objects that allows us to surface that to the admin so that I can see, I can see why you're going slow because you used the wrong storage policy, or you gave it the memory in megabytes instead of gigabytes. Or,
Yeah, that's
you
pretty-
can see all of that.
that's
all those
powerful.
changes that happen.
Yep. Now, I just have a question on that one. So you talked to VI admins, which many folks who are watching right now are, and I get some different responses. Some people are super excited. That's awesome. Some other people, though, I get, they say they're worried, right? They're like, oh no, is this thing totally changing? This is vSphere is Kubernetes now. What does that mean? So let me talk to that a little bit, and maybe also just relatedly, what we've seen is this sort of evolution of the VI admin role, right? Traditionally, they were just managing vSphere, just focused on compute virtualization. But now we've got vSAN in there, so now they gotta be a little bit storage knowledgeable. And now we got NSX in there, so we gotta be a little bit network knowledgeable. And we got vRealize in there, so we gotta be a little bit management knowledgeable. And now we're bringing Kubernetes in there.
Yeah.
So what does that evolution look like? And what are we driving that's consistent and that these folks can leverage as they evolve, and what's gonna be new?
That's a great question. And actually, as we're pointing out, when we started Project Pacific, the first engineers in the team were actually from our user experience team, not even architects or engineers, because it was exactly this problem. It was how, you run the risk that Kubernetes might be so foreign to a vSphere administrator that it's sort of intractable. You also run the risk that if you leave vSphere too much the same, you're trying to create some unsustainable abstraction, in mapping these things. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, first of all, there's a lot of synergies of concepts in Kubernetes from concepts in vSphere. So for example, in Kubernetes, you have requests and limits for pods of how much CPU and memory. Well, in vSphere, we have RLS, reservations, limits, and shares, right? So we spent a lot of time kind of mapping those constructs, and we achieved it in such a way that within vCenter, it kind of speaks to you in the language of vCenter. If you never wanted to learn Kubernetes, you can continue happily being a VI admin using the concepts you've learned. But the reality is just by using the product, you're going to be learning Kubernetes, right? And you're doing it just by using the patterns and workflows you've already been doing.
Yeah, and that's great, actually, and because I think this is obviously, as we said, an emerging technology, but one that's extremely popular already, and so it's only going to get bigger. And so this opportunity really then for folks to be able to start to get familiar, to familiarize themselves with it, while also in a familiar environment of vSphere, right? And actually, it was funny. I was just a few weeks ago at VMworld Barcelona. I was talking with one of our instructors, talking about the VMware Certified Professional, and this notion that, hey, maybe we're expanding that to actually include Kubernetes knowledge. That to be a VMware Certified Professional, you actually have to know some Kubernetes.
Yeah, it's been amazing to watch just within VMware. We have all these experts all over the company, all within the BUs and within our sales organization and overlay specialists, and to see how Kubernetes terminology has just sort of seeped its way into all those conversations. I hear people talking about pods and services and stateful sets and namespaces and things like this, and none of those people went through a Kubernetes training class. It's just sort of happens by osmosis, I guess.
Awesome. All right, Joe. So we've been talking about Pacific. Let's switch gears and talk about Tanzu Mission Control.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? Why is it important? Why is VMware doing it?
So, we were talking about earlier, we see, as organizations start adopting more and more of these modern platforms across more and more different environments, there's going to be a lot to manage there. And the goal of Mission Control is to really help you wrap your arms around all of that. So basically, what it is it's a SaaS service right now that allows you to both provision and attach to Kubernetes clusters. And when you have an attached Kubernetes cluster, you get visibility to what's happening in that cluster, along with the ability to apply policy to that. So you can start grouping your clusters, you can start grouping the different applications that are being applied across multiple clusters, get that visibility and apply policy. And then the other concept that we're introducing in Tanzu Mission Control is this idea of a workspace. And a workspace aligns with an application. It's similar in some ways to a namespace, but we wanted it to actually be something that was parallel to a single cluster. Because as we see application teams deal with the reality of multiple clusters, multiple geographies, multiple clouds, you need a way of essentially mapping your team structure to your infrastructure. And Mission Control really helps to sort of bring those two things together so that you can reason about which teams have access to which infrastructure under which situations. The really interesting thing that we're doing here across all of Tanzu is that we want those different pieces of Tanzu, they're loosely coupled. And so you can use Tanzu Mission Control with any Kubernetes cluster that you might have. So whether it's open source Kubernetes, whether it's one provided by a cloud provider, you can attach Mission Control, and because of the consistency of Kubernetes, you can actually get management across all your Kubernetes. Now, we're making that process streamlined and super easy with provisioning directly onto, starting with AWS and then adding Azure, and then also, including Project Pacific as we bring these things together. So we want to have sort of a really easy experience when you're provisioning from within Mission Control, but then also if you have your own existing ways of doing things and working with Kubernetes, we can adapt and work with you there.
Got it. So I think for a lot of the folks watching right now, again, they're going to be more vSphere-centric in their focus and may not have as much experience managing Kubernetes clusters. So I'd love to, if you could give some context around what are the challenges today that, as you talk to customers who have Kubernetes clusters running all over the place, like why, first of all, why are they running all over the place? Why do they have some stuff in Google and AWS and on-prem? And what are the challenges that they have trying to manage across all those different clusters?
Yeah, well, so first of all, complexity happens inside of enterprise organizations and footprints, and so there's a wide variety of reasons why enterprises might be multi-cloud, might be on-prem and in-cloud. Number one is a lot of times there's a risk mitigation aspect to it. Sometimes this is, regulators mandate that you must, be running across multiple clouds. But even so, I think, a lot of startups, they're willing to say, hey, one cloud all the time, that's great. They're worried about making sure they're in business a month from now. Mature enterprises, the types of risks that you look at end up being different than, I think, smaller companies. And so looking across cloud is a key sort of, risk mitigation factor. Sometimes there's cost and capabilities. There are some capabilities available on some clouds, but not on other clouds. There are oftentimes really, really useful, groundbreaking, unique features in a specific cloud. You want to be able to take advantage of that. And those things are not all concentrated on a single provider. Another example here is, you might make acquisitions, right? So, you're like, hey, we've standardized, and then it's like, we finally got everybody on the same platform, and then oops, made an acquisition, right? And that's just an ongoing thing. And so, these things just happen as you integrate different systems.
You haven't mentioned our good friend Shadow IT.
Exactly. Yeah. This is the other thing is that, well, I think Shadow IT is really fascinating because I think one of the opportunities around Tanzu and Pacific in general is this idea that you can provide a cloud-like experience to your application teams with the constraints around policy that you need. And if we can do that, then all of a sudden those application teams won't feel the need to actually go behind your back and actually go direct to the cloud providers.
And the reason they're doing that oftentimes is there's pressing business concerns.
They want to get stuff done.
Yeah, and I think, and we see this a lot, right, where one of the big challenges for businesses is actually the process change in addition to the technology change. And
there's a leap of faith in trusting developers to self-service.
And like the shadow IT is them a lot of times running around the process more than the technology. And so like if you can give them that capability and have it be on-prem, you can then add the policy, maintain that sort of governance of those activities. Okay, so mission control.
Yeah, so mission control. So you have this stuff running in all these different environments, and basically what we do is we help you see and manage, push the policy there. Now the complications as you're running Kubernetes across a bunch of these different environments is being able to apply the appropriate security policy, making sure that your clusters are conformant, making sure that you have them locked down, from a permissions point of view, understanding the usage across all of these things. If you have a standard solution around sort of, say logging or monitoring or auditing, you want to make sure that you apply that consistently. And so there's all these sort of policy management, sort of visibility things that you're going to want to apply consistency regardless of where you're running Kubernetes. And mission control helps you to apply those things, and then also helps you get visibility in terms of the output of those different systems.
And how does mission control work across these different environments that you said may have different capabilities? Like how do you deal with that sort of heterogeneity?
Well, I think the idea here is that Kubernetes does provide a consistent platform for being able to plug into these things. And so one of the things that mission control does is runs an open source tool that we created with Heptio called Sonoboy, which essentially ensures that you have a conformant Kubernetes cluster, that your Kubernetes cluster hasn't drifted, it hasn't actually broken in some way. And so if you're conformant, there's all the extension mechanisms, those things are guaranteed by those conformance tests so that we can plug in and get that visibility and sort of use the built-in extension mechanisms of Kubernetes to be able to do that. Now there will be differences across different environments because again, one of the reasons why you want to run on a specific cloud might be to get access to certain features.
Sure.
And so the goal with Tanzu and Kubernetes in general is to abstract all the things that we can abstract and also help you to consume those sort of differences in a responsible way. So if you're building something that's going to create friction if you do need to move between instances, between clouds, we want you to go in eyes open, know what you're doing, and not actually sort of accidentally start taking in those, taking advantage of those extended features that may create friction for you if you want to move later.
Got it. So I have a question for both of you actually now. So we've seen with vCenter, manager for ESX infrastructure, right? And mission control, essentially a manager for Kubernetes infrastructure. And then we also have Pacific, which is Kubernetes in vSphere. And so how should our customers start thinking about all these things? How do they layer onto each other? When should you use which, when? Help us work through that.
Well, I think that we see kind of three distinct user personas that exist here, right? So starting from the vSphere side, I think we have IT admins who manage my vSphere infrastructure, and those folks do what they do and are going to continue doing that, and just with better tools. Then you have software development teams who are trying to build applications and deploy their applications on some kind of cloud infrastructure. And then the third persona, which is I think kind of the new one, is you have the emergence of these platform teams. And these come in many forms, like many organizations have like DBAs and like database administration teams. And I think around Kubernetes, we're seeing these sort of central Kubernetes experts that own the platform. And they consume the infrastructure from the IT department, but they're setting the rules of like, okay, what kind of conformance tests are we doing? How are we delivering this Kubernetes infrastructure to those application teams?
Yeah, so I think that Pacific ends up being the best way to run Kubernetes in vSphere, and regardless of whether you're running that on premises or in cloud with the various offerings with public clouds, and then Tanzu Mission Control essentially ends up being that interface between developers and application teams at scale as you deal with sort of the full breadth of the infrastructure that you deal with. And and we're going to be continuing to actually bring these things closer together and drive more and more integration between them.
Because like with Mission Control, I can manage infrastructure across vSphere, but also all the mega clouds.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's actually getting to my next question, which is this whole notion. We see a lot of customers trying to go toward hybrid cloud, and not just hybrid cloud in terms of, okay, I've got some on-prem stuff and some cloud stuff, but actually delivering that cloud as a model anywhere, right? Both on-prem and the cloud at the edge. So how do these offerings help customers move toward that? How should they be thinking about this?
So I think from my point of view, as enterprises continue to modernize, as IT goes from being a necessary evil to actually being a driver of value that becomes a differentiator for the business, being able to deliver new software-based capabilities at an increased cadence with more quality so that you can be competitive in the marketplace, that's for many, many customers their top-line concern. How can we, I'm going to use the word, how can we transform ourselves into a software company so that we can compete in this hyper-competitive world that we're in now? Doing that, looking across infrastructure, what you want to really do is you want to make sure that if you have an application team that has a skill set, that skill set is as portable as possible regardless of where they need to run. Right, and so that platform team, if you're saying, hey, we're moving from cloud A to cloud B, there may be some elbow grease to be able to actually sort of instantiate your platform across these different things, but you want to reduce the switching cost and the retraining cost and the sort of cognitive overhead of your application teams having to deal with those differences.
I think there's a lot of different motivations for hybridity, right? So you see some organizations that have a bunch of workloads in their data center, and they're looking to move from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. And so, solutions like VMC on AWS and our VCPP partners kind of allow you to do that. You want to get out of the data center business, but you don't want to re-architect all your applications. You can help you move things. We also see people doing the inverse, so people that have applications that they're running on public cloud and realizing, oh man, this is actually a pretty predictable workload. There's pretty great cost efficiency that I can get by moving it on-prem, or maybe I need more control over the data or compliance and things like that. So taking things off. What Kubernetes is interesting because it presents this, regardless of where that workload is running, it's the single interface. Like the developer doesn't really need to worry about whether this is running on AWS or on vSphere or on Azure. It becomes this lingua franca. And I think before Kubernetes, we were stuck with either you got this API set for this cloud and this other API set for a different cloud, or we had these, going back to the Goldilocks analogy, we had these abstraction layers trying to hide the complexity of these clouds, but none of them quite got it right. They were always either least common denominator or didn't allow you to take advantage of the unique features. And so I think with this whole portfolio, we've got this great combination of the on-prem to cloud mobility with VMC and vSphere, and you've got this multi-cloud portability and unified interface for developers through Kubernetes.
That's awesome. So we've touched on Tanzu, the portfolio, the broad thing. We touched on Pacific, we touched on mission control. A lot of different things here. For folks that are just hearing about this or want to learn more, what's the right next step? What's the first thing they should go do?
Well, if you want to get started with Kubernetes today, we have products in the market. So this is Enterprise PKS. We're happy to get you going right away with PKS, and we're going to make sure that the customers that we have on PKS, as we roll out Pacific, as we continue this journey, we're going to take those folks with us for sure. And we're going to make sure that they have a good experience through that. Learning about Kubernetes, one of the things that we launched at VMworld was Kube.Academy. So this is an online resource that starts giving you an introduction in terms of what Kubernetes is, how it works, get you a little bit into the nitty-gritty details. And we're going to be looking to expand those educational resources over time so that folks can really start getting comfortable with Kubernetes.
And that's not anything VMware specific,
no, that's
right?
That's just Kubernetes, plain Jane, vanilla Kubernetes. And so we think, it's great. We very much view this as a sort of rising tide lifts all boats. The more folks that are comfortable with Kubernetes, the the better it is for everybody, and the more opportunity that ends up creating long term for VMware.
I mean, I would add to that. I mean, you go do the Kubernetes Academy, you do the training, but the Kubernetes community is a pretty amazing thing, right? You got these KubeCon conferences. There's 3 a year all over the world. Go to KubeCon. There's probably one near you, and it's just a spectacular coming together of equals, right? It's not like some vendor sort of organizes this whole thing. It's a bunch of peers from a bunch of different software vendors, customers, open source committers, and it's a great place to go learn about Kubernetes, understand how other people are applying it, and how their organizations are trying to get into it. There's great educational resources. You also learn a lot of different open source projects and solutions that might be relevant.
Yeah, I think there's a word of warning there. The cloud native ecosystem, sort of Kubernetes plus all these other open, it's like this beautiful chaos right now. There's so much innovation going on, so many people playing with new ideas. It can be overwhelming. But I think it's also very invigorating to actually see that there's so much interesting, things going on. At the core of this is Kubernetes, and you can be useful ignoring a lot of the noise. But also, it can be really invigorating to sort of, start to wrap your head around and understand all the really, innovative, fascinating ways that folks are using this technology.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to especially even in the early VMware days, there's a lot of tinkering happening, a lot of projects out there, people doing different things, and you're right, it is. I mean, I guess it's probably still total chaos. It was definitely total chaos 3 years ago.
It's beautiful chaos.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, there we go. But I think this notion of, as we look at folks wanting to sharpen some of their technical skills, there's a lot of interesting technology out there, and I think to your point, Jared, there's a lot of community as well. It's not just this tech sitting by itself, but in fact, there's whole communities around it. And so this notion of getting involved in that.
It's empowering, I think, for a lot of folks with, if you want to, you can actually help shape the technology. You can get in there, you can move the conversation forward. And we're seeing, folks not just consuming the technology, but also influencing it and driving it.
Yep.
And in some ways, it's redefining our relationship with customers, because we actually see them as customers, but then we also see them as peers in the community too. And it's been a fascinating thing.
Well, I think for the VMUG community, right? You guys have this expertise in operations,
in perspective,
that the Kubernetes community can learn from. So it's
a
part
two-way
of it
street.
Is how you learn about Kubernetes, but I think actually the Kubernetes community has a lot to learn from the VMUG community.
I think that's an excellent point, actually, because of the fact that, people have been running vSphere, the SDDC in production for decades, right? I mean, it's been around a long time. And as we mentioned, Kubernetes is still somewhat in its early phases. And so I think a lot of the problems that have been solved within the vSphere SDDC community still have not yet been solved on the Kubernetes side. And so I think going back to your points, this opportunity for information sharing, for experience sharing that, yes, it's different in the sense it's, Kubernetes containers versus VMs, but a lot of times it's same sort of enterprise requirements for running in production, it's like security still matters, performance is a thing.
Yeah.
So awesome. Yeah. So I think that's a great note to end on there, and this notion of opportunity really for all of our VI admins, folks who are in the vSphere VMUG community, to really take all those skills that you've learned and start applying those to a new area. As we're doing with Pacific, they'll be built in, but just in general with Kubernetes, there's a lot of opportunity here because again, these things need to be operated just like any sort of vSphere environment. Awesome. Well, Joe, Jared, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. Everyone online, thank you so much for tuning in. This is the VMUG virtual event keynote. And again, thank you for coming. We got a whole other day of activity though, so please look around. There's a bunch of interesting content out there, so please go check it out. Thank you very much.